So I've been doing a lot of work with some federal agencies on space. Most people are really concerned about what's happening on the ground with your daily lives, and rightfully so. But we should all be concerned about what's happening in space because it affects every one of us every single day. Just briefly about myself. As I said, I'm the founder of Digijax. I formerly worked at the White House and also at the National Archives, the cybersecurity expert for the Small Business Administration, and I do some work with USGIF and some other agencies as well. So we've all seen pictures of launches and rockets going up in space, or maybe the explosion last week with SpaceX. It's exciting. You know, I don't know, has anyone ever been to a launch? Raise your hands if you ever have. So if the people who've been there, you know it's very loud. There's a lot of commotion. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of logistics that goes into it. And people think, oh, the launch, great. The rocket's up, satellites in space, we're good to go. Actually, that's really just the beginning of the cybersecurity issues that occur with this. You have to think about the complexity of what's going on with a launch. You have a ground station, you have a satellite, you have a payload, you have the launch itself, you have the data going up and down. There's actually multiple streams of data. In commercial satellites, there's 8 or 9 levels of information going up and down. And government satellites, it can be even more depending on what kind of satellite it is. The cybersecurity was kind of an afterthought for space for a long time. It just wasn't something that people were thinking as a threat. And it was only recently that we started to see, no pun intended, an explosion of commercial space companies starting to use government facilities, government launch facilities, and that's created just a huge number of launches, of payloads, of satellites, just a tremendous amount of activity going on around the globe. So really, it was just until about 5 years ago that the satellite makers and the ground station equipment manufacturers really started to think, like, what's going on here? And then that happened at the same time that CERT issued several warnings about the ground station satellite, the technology in the ground stations, and how vulnerable they were. So 25 years ago, there were basically dozens of satellites in space. Now, this is a live picture taken roughly 1,100 satellites or pieces of satellites in space right now. That includes space debris from satellites that are depreciating. This is not including just the junk that's up there, the batteries and whatever from over the space flights. There are websites that track all this. So these two images are taken from open source. My entire remarks today is open source, generated entirely from research on the open web. There is a website that allows you to track every single satellite, where it is, what it's doing, who launched it, what its payload is, what its height is, its azimuth, everything that's going on with the satellite you can track in real time. Because it's open source, that means that the criminals, the bad guys, the nation-state actors also have access to the same information. Now, where it says lots of data, this is actually a website that shows these different types of images. You can click on any one of those dots, and you'll see the full information about that satellite in real time. So let's back up. The first thing about cybersecurity that I believe is most important is people. And this is true in any organization, whether it's space, the FBI, a bank, school, whatever. It comes down to people. BYOD, bring your own device. This is a relatively new phenomenon. We all do it. I'm sure some of us probably carry 2 or 3 devices at a time. Multiply that by the number of people in the facility. Multiply that by the number of people those people know. And suddenly you start thinking about the exponential relationships that occur just through one person and their device. And this leads to social engineering. Social engineering takes on a bunch of different levels, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but basically it's the idea of people using psychology to get into your head so that you're then revealing your passwords. You're giving up information about your organization. Social engineering can come through open source research on the internet. It can come through people knowing you. And so when you are looking at the cybersecurity relationship of people to their devices, the social engineering part of it is playing a huge role constantly. The USBs, obviously, most government facilities don't allow you to walk in and out with a USB for good reason. USBs can be used not just to insert malware, to also exfiltrate data, but they can also be used to air gap, to jump the air gap between machines now, so that a USB could be put into a device, and that could actually be used to air gap whatever's on that device. A walk-by photo, video, SMS, social media. That's the idea of, okay, you've got something on your desk. You're in a trusted environment, so you don't think about it. You go to lunch, or you go to breakfast, or go to the bathroom, and you leave your stuff on the table, on the desk, and someone walks by and takes a picture of it, and then within seconds, that picture is wherever it needs to be. It's on the internet, it's in social media, it's to an enemy, another nation state. A lot of people are lazy with their devices. Just comes with time. You don't want to do more than a 4-digit password. You don't want to maybe use biometrics. You want to kind of make it easy. But that ease of use makes it really easy for criminals and nation states to break in as well. Obviously, people can be corrupt. They can be leveraged by organized crime or foreign intelligence services. And there's the disregard of security protocols. We all hear about that a lot. But it's actually a big deal, especially with BYOD, because what it does is once you're saying, well, I'm going to ignore the basic security protocols and I'm going to use my multiple devices, those multiple devices, you've just broken 100 different ways of the security protocols, not just the 1 or 2. And then, of course, there's someone who's actually willfully intending to do some damage, cause espionage or damage. And the devices themselves can be hacked. So you have to think about that when you're carrying your device into the organization or into a ground station facility, for example. In this case, in our business, we recommend that everyone, whether our senior management or anyone coming into a conference room, they actually take their devices and put them into a lock box on the outside of the room. It's a lead box or steel box that doesn't allow any signals in or out of it. People get pretty pissed off when you say, you know what, you cannot have your phone in here. It's a security risk. They'll say, well, I'm the CEO or I'm the whatever, and I need my phone. No, you don't. For those 45 minutes, you can put it in the box. And so organizations that aren't doing this, right away, you're making a very clear mistake with the BYOD world and cybersecurity. Device access to ground station networks needs to be really closely monitored. This is true in any organization, but in this situation where you've got real-time data going up and down in a 24-hour stream, you have to be wondering why someone is using a VPN or remote by proxy or late-night email logins when that's not their job and that's not their responsibility. What is that person doing at 3 in the morning using a VPN to do something? Okay, you have to start looking at those anomalies, because in this type of situation, those anomalies actually usually are showing you a pattern of behavior. And that's also true for home server logins that aren't at a normal time schedule or something's off about it. In addition to this, the physical security concerns, so obviously you have gates, you've got cameras, you've got guards, dogs, etc. The BYOD can also be used to actually insert malware. So someone can bring a phone, a smartphone, connect it to a network, and from their smartphone, they could actually put something onto the network. Now, the network would hopefully catch it, and there might be some sort of time where it won't work. But someone with intention, and this is really the important word here, someone with intent can use almost any kind of device to walk into your facility. If they're cleared and they're approved to be in that facility, they can do all kinds of damage. And a BYOD device can also be used to exfiltrate data and also, like I said, to transmit that data instantly. So someone who's a guest in your facility at a ground station, for example, could walk in, take a picture of something on a desk, and before you even knew it, they have it out onto the dark web, onto social media, SMS texting. I mean, this stuff takes seconds. So once somebody has it on their device, it's literally seconds, maybe less, before it's spread around the world. Ground stations are physical locations. They're usually pretty big. Sometimes they're small. Often they're in remote locations. And oftentimes what happens is, because of the remoteness of the location, the physical security aspect is we have a fence, we've got cameras, some motion sensors, but we're good, because no one's going to come out to the desert, or no one's going to come out to the mountains, or whatever. because of the physical proximity, actually these ground stations are a real target for cybersecurity people, because they've learned that the ground stations up until recently really weren't that well protected, and that it was pretty easy to kind of fake being a contractor and walk in the grounds of one of these. So because they are these giant physical things, they attract a lot of attention. I talk about people a lot because it's really important. The people, the training, the understanding how we all work together, who are the threats, who are the people that you've invited as guests. But when you think about the cybersecurity for a ground station for a satellite setup, there's actually a number of levels going on here. So people's number one. They have incoming data from other ground station networks, and that could be in the form of a phone call, that could be data, that could be an SMS, that could be fax, that could be almost any way that the information is being transmitted. It depends on the age of the other ground station or the age of the legacy system providing that data in the first place. Then you have incoming data from the internet and extranets, incoming data that's bound for a satellite payload uplink, and then the outgoing data bound from the satellite payload downlink, uplink data, downlink data, maintenance level, control level, security level. There are a few others. Military, there's some other levels as well. And with weather satellites, there's also some other levels. But this is what you're looking at when you're talking about what's going on with a ground station and the cybersecurity concerns around it. And this is where you really have to think about, there's a merger of physical and cybersecurity that has to occur. To make a force multiplier work in this instance, physical and cyber have to be brought together, because you're talking about physical situations. You're talking about ground stations. Because they're physical, they're attractive physical targets, they are not considered critical infrastructure. So unless there is a threat specifically made on a ground station, most of the time you will never see National Guard around a ground station, or FBI or police. You'll see some paid security contractor, if that. Oftentimes it's just a fence. These ground stations are really easy to identify and track. There are websites where you can actually put in the name of a facility, and it'll tell you all of the devices that are connected to the internet from that facility. And then you can actually go deeper in a deeper dive into each device and figure out, what are the default passwords for that device? What are the default resets? Once you start using online research, and again, everything I did here today is just open source from the internet, you can actually figure out, okay, this ground station is tracking this type of satellite using this type of server, using this type of equipment, using this type of software, all for free. All it takes is the time and effort to do this. If I can do this, or you can do this, so can China, so can Russia, so can Iran, and so can the hacking cartels. You also have SCADA installs that are connected to the internet, and again, same thing. With the SCADA devices, you can pull down the default passwords, the default reset data. You don't have to be a computer expert to do this stuff. You literally just have to know how to use Google and do a little extra research. You don't have to be on the dark web to get this kind of information, which is actually a little bit scary, because you realize that someone with ill intent could spend some time doing some research, and they then have a fully prepared cyber attack ready to go. And then this is a real-world representation of the need to blend physical and cybersecurity into one force multiplier. And I think that this last sentence is something that really carries well beyond the cybersecurity issues of satellites and ground stations, but really into almost any activity or anything that has a physical relationship. So an important question is, when you're thinking of your ground station cybersecurity, what does your ground station cybersecurity look like from space? So if you're running a ground station, you have to assume someone's targeting you, whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or a company that's some shadowy LLC in the Bahamas. Someone's looking down from space, and they're looking at your movements, they're looking at the people, they're looking at the signals coming in and out, and they might actually be cataloging that simply from space, and you're not even paying attention to that. So this is like, when you're talking about securing the facility and you're going and everyone's looking down. Well, we have to look up too. So, we all think we know who the attackers are. We probably have a fairly good idea most of the time. The attackers, for sure, know who we are. For sure. This is just a very brief list of attacks that have occurred onto satellite systems globally. This most recent one, this 2016 one, the information from that is still kind of coming out because the Australian government has kind of clamped down on the full facts of this. But in this case, the company, Newstar, their network was so corrupted and it was so bad that the NSA refused to install software into their ground station that they would normally install to allow encrypted traffic to go back and forth. They literally refused. And the Australians said, well, it's not that bad, we'll fix it, we'll fix it. They ended up having to put in a new network in the Newstar company 3 times. That company's now bankrupt because they literally couldn't fix the amount of problems that they had, mostly attributed to the Chinese. And this was a very pervasive attack. They went after the satellites, they went after the ground stations, they went after the companies that were the intermediaries, and they actually went after the ground data streams as well. In 2013-14, the US weather systems, the non-military NOAA satellites were hacked. This was attributed to the Chinese, and mostly at that point they just gave bad weather. They didn't really do anything. They weren't tasked to move. They didn't change their geospatial orbit, but they could have been. There have been a number of commercial satellites that have been penetrated since 2012, although it might have been earlier. No one's really sure. This has been mostly attributed to the Russians using an APT, Turla APT. And what they went after is the satellite protocols, again, with the knowledge that in 2014, US CERT issued multiple alerts about the hardware and software containing ground stations. And this Russian attack apparently kind of went after that specifically. They'd already been studying that. And again, the ground station software and hardware from multiple manufacturers was flagged in 2014 for cybersecurity failures, and the CERT notification was issued, but only some companies have made updates. And so there's a number of companies' legacy systems that haven't made that update yet. And so there's, around the world, there's a lot of places where there's ground stations that just haven't made the connection. So the attackers know you. We've heard about GPS being attacked. The Simplex network has a number of known and unknown vulnerabilities in it. Some of these are probably pretty bad. There have been a number of warnings that have been issued. And then this can be used to exfil sensitive data from both government, military, and diplomatic, as well as companies and education researchers. In space, you have several factors that become weak points. So there's an uplink from the ground. There's unencrypted or already corrupted. The downlink is the same. The penetration or control of the data stream and the redistributing of the data so that the bird's still in space, but the data that's coming down from it's really messed up, or they've changed the orbit, or they've changed anything, basically. So then you also have the loss of a satellite through willful destruction or terrorism, hunter-killer satellites from opponents, and corruption of the location or timing for signal control that then renders the satellite useless or dangerous, or both. There's loss of command and control through the ground infiltration or penetration. There's acquisition of signals and different levels of bands from space from another satellite that could be tasked with basically hunting and killing that satellite. There's also satellites that the Chinese have put up that have sensors and lasers in them that are specifically designed to go after the components of another satellite, take it out from afar without having to physically crash into it. And the Russians have been working on similar tests as well. The cyber attacks in space are becoming more and more common. You don't hear about them a lot just because it's not something that most reporters can kind of get their heads around, and a lot of these are classified. So they don't really make the news that much, but there's a lot of this going on. And you have to really ask yourself the basic question, how can a satellite or a group of satellites, a group of CubeSats, be used in a malicious way against a country or against a company or person? So do you know who's watching from above or why? These are just basic questions that I think are important for all of us to be asking in any cybersecurity component, whether it's space or ground stations or whatever. And then the threat matrix is pretty simple. It goes into like the same type of threat matrix that we're dealing with cybersecurity throughout. It's know your weaknesses, know the weakness of the staff, the training, the software. Anticipate that you will be attacked, because it is not if, but it is definitely when. And then we have to use both internal and external sources of information to stay apprised. You have to be looking at the open net and seeing, are your devices listed? Can someone go find the default password, the default reset on your device in your installation? Well, figure it out, because there's stuff on the web that can tell you whether your installation is revealing this type of information. And the attacks are going to occur onto all of this. This is what's going on now, and this is what we all have to be dealing with, whether it's military, commercial, diplomatic, and even universities that are doing research have to be dealing with this because of the intellectual property nature of the research and development, and the fact that the research and development then flows into corporations and governments, so the Chinese and the Russians and other players want to try to go after this. There's also hacking cartels that are basically, they operate like drug cartels, but they're designed to be hacking cartels, and they have a CEO, they have runners, they sometimes might even have a customer support person, but they run it as a business. They run the hacking as a business. How much profit can they get from hacking satellites versus credit cards? Well, I guarantee you that if you go on the dark net and you look up, what's the information on a certain satellite, it's going to cost you more than buying someone's credit card number or social security number. The price of it will be a lot higher. So that creates a real target for criminals. The threat actors that I have identified here, doing a lot of research on this, the obvious ones are China and Russia and Iran. North Korea is less obvious because they aren't really have a huge internet capability. They are, however, very active in space. They are trying. You can make jokes about it, but they are constantly launching stuff, whether they're good or not. They are in space, they're trying to be in space, and they have the technology at the very least to disrupt the ground stations and to go after other satellites. Whether they have the technology to go up in space and actually make a hunter-killer satellite, that's a different issue. Vietnam has become a place where it's essentially a hacker hideaway. Cambodia, Vietnam, a lot of hackers have gone to those countries because the perception is that they're not such strong cyber players, so it gives the criminals or the nation-state players a place to hide, basically, where you wouldn't think they're coming from Vietnam, because people just don't think of Vietnam as a cybersecurity kind of risk. Ukraine and Romania, mostly because of, in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet states still train classical math. We don't do that. So because they're training their students in classical mathematics, what that does is that creates a situation where basically the youngest people in their schools have the ability to create algorithms, to code, whether they're doing it maliciously or not. Ukraine and Romania are seen to be real bastions of this. In fact, many American companies will go specifically to those two countries to hire coders because they've been trained with classical mathematics. And there's a host of other countries as well that have sophisticated telecoms networks or where the traditional computing is taught. And then there's the paid hacker cartels and the paid hacker soldiers of war. There's companies that are using technology and satellites to spy on their competition and on their staff or clients. And the bad actors could be anyone doing unethical work or illegal work, sometimes under the cover of helping. There are even cybersecurity companies who quote-unquote help, but they end up actually hacking to then turn around and charge. Your own people, your own equipment, and your own networks. These are some suggested changes. I'm not going to go through them all just for time's sake, but I think that when you look at these, the knowledge here is pretty basic, but it's the steps that you have to take, really going into all these different levels, because the cybersecurity for satellites and ground stations is actually fairly complex. You're talking about a lot of moving parts, a lot of people, a lot of geolocated physical facilities, and then a huge amount of data, terabytes of data going daily. One ground station, one satellite alone could be dealing with terabytes of data. So when you multiply that out by the countries and the players involved, it's just a huge amount. Training, drill your people, really treat this as, let's go through an exercise and then do it again, and here's where you failed, so let's do it again because you failed, so let's try it again until you get it right. Because this isn't just about doing a computer test and passing it one time and then you're certified for cybersecurity. It doesn't work that way. Again, all these are fairly basic. Install two-factor authentication for everything. Inside of a network, social media, data, uplink, downlink, They should always have that because it's at least, it's not a perfect measure, but it's a way that you can certainly stop a lot of the general hacking because they have to have that two-factor piece. Again, and that could be corrupted as well, but it's an important aspect of this. And then disable the use of BOAD on premises of ground stations, or at least put it into an isolated area. Here's your room, you can use here's your room to make phone calls. The rest of the time your phone stays in a box somewhere. Same with tablets, same with Apple watches or Samsung watches or whatever. Shodan.io is a website. It's an open source website that is one of the ones I use to generate some of those images. With Shodan, you can actually go in and identify a location, identify the devices that are in that location, and then literally go device by device and look for the default passwords. You can look for problems with that device. You can see whether the device is connected to the internet or not, what the ports are that they're using. This is all open source. It's all on the internet. I strongly suggest that facility managers train their people to start looking on the web, the open web and the dark web, for this type of information. Because when your information is already out there, you have to assume you've already been breached. Because someone's already copied it and someone's already been using it. Whether you see it or not, it's already happened. So I want to thank you very much. Sorry if I went a few minutes over.
You had mentioned 100 killer satellites. What exactly do these attacks look like, and how easy are they to detect? Because at least to me, again, it seems like satellites attacking other satellites should be obvious.
It should be obvious. There's two kinds of, well, there's probably more than that, but to very broadly here, there's two kinds. There's a 100 killer satellite that literally will launch itself into another satellite and blow both up. And then there's ones that the Chinese and the Russians have been working on that have onboard sensors and lasers that they can use to target another satellite from a distance. I'm only talking about what our adversaries are doing with this. It's possible that we have some technology similar. I don't know. But the issue of the 100 killer satellite, it was originally like, how can we knock a satellite out of the sky? By launching another satellite and making them crash. And that's still kind of part of it. There are now ones, from what I've read, that the Chinese have been working on, where they have a physical satellite in space that can then launch a second sort of smaller module that then becomes the 100 killer, but the main one stays up so they're not losing the bird. There's a number of efforts to integrate technology on board of a satellite that could knock out the sensors or to change the data. Or to change the GPS settings, position. If you change the position of the satellite even a little bit, you're making it useless. So it could still be in space, but it'd just be a floating piece of $100 million junk.